Hey folks, it's Tyler Buchheit again for Steiner Tractor Parts, coming to you today from my shop here in Ellis Grove, Illinois. The star of our show today is the John Deere Model 630. This is a 1959 model, and although it's not a trailer queen or something you would really be happy to drag to the show and talk about how slick the paint is, she does run pretty darn well, and we just bought about 15 acres with it. But moving on to the topic of this video today is the fuel gauge. And I hate to say the fuel gauge on the 630 is not working, which is very common for the 20 and 30 series tractors that John Deere built out of the Waterloo, Iowa factory. It's rather embarrassing when you run out of gas, and seems like it always happens either if you're at a show or in a public place, or if you're in the back of the back 40, and then you get to walk back to your house and try to find a gas can. But that aside, we're going to talk a little bit about the fuel gauge. Essentially, it's just two pieces. And lucky for us, Steiner supplies both. We've got a sending unit, which essentially is just a potentiometer. Depending upon where this float is, it changes the resistance in the unit, and the wire goes back to the fuel gauge, and it basically measures the resistance in the potentiometer. The fuel gauge was an optional unit from John Deere. I think a lot of folks may assume that it was standard equipment, but it was not. You had to actually check the box on the order form at the John Deere dealer to get a fuel gauge. Something like a $4 option probably in 1955 or 58. That being said, if your tractor does not have one, to install a fuel gauge, you'll have to punch out the little metal spot in the dash panel that would just be covered over or just intact. But other than that, the fuel tank itself will have a blank plate in the top of the tank where the sending unit would normally go. So it's really not anything that it's going to involve a lot of surgery or a deep thought, although you might have to take some care to make sure when you cut out or punch out the metal for the gauge, just to use caution. Alright, so the equipment that Steiner has provided for the 20 and 30 series tractors that use a 12-volt system. It's important to note you have to have a positive ground on your tractor. If you don't have a positive ground, to install the Steiner gauge, you're going to need to convert your tractor back to its original positive ground configuration. Now that can get kind of hairy depending upon what electronic equipment you've got on your tractor, so I won't go into that detail today. But just absolutely have to have a positive ground for this unit to work. So what Steiner's provided is the sending unit, which is a part number JDS 1712. It's available from their website or through their catalog by calling Steiner. And they also have the gauge. It's a 12-volt positive ground. It's a JDS 1707. So really, that's all there is. Aside from that, additional items you're going to need for this project that are not included as part of a kit or anything is some wire to connect from your key switch, or not a key switch, but the ignition switch on your tractor that gives power to your gauge. As we'll Steiner sent along a diagram. It's kind of handy. Shows it and keeps things fairly simple. So this is the back of our gauge, as you can see here. So power supply comes in on this side, which is the full side, and then the other terminal, the wire goes to the signal post on the fuel gauge itself. And if you'll note, it's stamped in ink. This is ground, GND, and this is the signal post. So aside from that, an additional step that is not part of the original configuration from John Deere. The original equipment would have just looked like this with one wire from the sending unit to the gauge. And the way the Steiner setup is, and although in theory it's not necessary and it's certainly a best practice, and I absolutely recommend that you ground the gauge and the sending unit, the ground terminal on the sending unit, and you can ground, we're going to ground from one of the mounting terminal studs on our gauge, and we're going to ground that to a good ground on the tractor somewhere. This is going to ensure that everything is grounded properly so that our gauge works. The reason for doing this is you remove your hood, you might find there's a little bit of rust under there after all these years, especially in the tank area with a lot of condensation and whatnot. So we're just trying to eliminate the possibility of having a faulty ground. Well, to get started on installing a fuel gauge sending unit, this is probably the most exciting point of the video. It's getting to remove all the hood and the nose cone. Now, if it's been off of your tractor recently, probably not that big of a deal. Although if it's freshly painted or something, you probably want to have a friend to help. But sometimes the nuts that are made into the sheet metal, namely here, and on the other side, sometimes they get frozen up, and it may be necessary to use a die grinder to cut the bolt head off and deal with the consequences of that afterward. But to take the sheet metal off, if you've never had the pleasure of doing so on your 20 or 30 series tractor, very similar. In fact, virtually the same number of fasteners in the same location, although the hood is shaped differently. So to start with, you would remove your radiator cap. That's a vintage radiator cap. Perhaps I need to check out the Steiner catalog. Maybe it's time. But on another note, we got to take the nose cone off. So there are bolts, the exterior bolts you can see on top of the nose cone that tie into the hood panel. There is a stud and a bolt here, which I've already removed, and a spring. And there's a stud that comes down from your grill screen area downward in through this casting, and there's a nut and a spring and a washer, or there should be, on both sides there. It's also pretty common, although we didn't have any on this tractor, that there would be bolts up here for you, where you would use a for mounting a cultivator or whatnot. So once you remove the nose cone, it'll be necessary to remove the muffler and the pre-cleaner air stack if your tractor has one. And then also at the back of the hood, you've got 4 bolts, 2 on the top, 2 on the sides. And if yours still has it in place, there should be 2 little bolts about halfway up the length of the hood. Now, this one, like many others, 50 years of vibration and fatigue has let that sheet metal weld loose and no longer there. So we'll get to work at getting that off, and we'll come back in a bit and check out the fuel tank and the sending unit.
Okay, on the 630s and 20 series, after you take the nose cone off, you have 2 bolts down here. And you either have straight bolts like this, or you might have actually a rubber grommet ahead of that too. And once you take these bolts off, and the muffler and the air intake, you also need to take off the fuel tank cap and the grommet around it. If it's not broken, you might have to replace it. Steiner should have that.
Yeah, they've got it. Folks, this is my brother Alex. He's been the videographer, but I thought he needed to sharpen his skills, so there we go. Well, I'm going to put down the video camera and spare you the agony of watching us lift the hood off. Actually, this isn't too bad, but not something you want to try by yourself. Hey, who knows? I mean, maybe someday we'll actually paint this tractor. Well, now that we've got the hood off, Alex has proceeded to take out the original fuel gauge. And notice he's taking some gentle, tender, loving care. Not really, since it's malfunctioning. But sometimes the terminal studs and the mounting studs in the back of the original gauges can be rather rusted. So use whatever means you have to. Just be mindful not to hurt your other gauges, because you notice in the 30 series, there's the oil pressure gauge, which has a copper line going to it, or a steel line. Then you've got the temperature gauge right next to it, which obviously has a lead, so you can't take it all out. And of course the ammeter would just have wires attached to it. And you'll note Alex is having a hard time getting the gauge out, just because there's rust and crud stuck to the housing, and the hole is a pretty tight fit. So we'll get that out in just a bit and move on to the sending unit. Seeing as we've already gotten into some wiring, it's probably good to note that you should always disconnect your battery, your either one or both cables from your battery when doing anything pertaining to wiring. Obviously we don't want to start a fire or have to replace more of the wiring harness than what we already have. So that's what we are coming to you with, that safety message. Oh, you've got the camera on. I was just admiring myself in this nice chrome fuel cap, the non-vented type, that I got from Steiner. Anyway, since I don't know remember the part number for that, we're going to move on to the task at hand. So, now with the hood off, we've got the fuel gauge out of the dash, which was kind of a pain because it just didn't want to come out very easily. So, the next step, battery removed, of course, especially anytime we have a gas tank. There's probably 3 or 4 inches of gasoline in this tank, so we're going to take great care, obviously not to create any sparks. If you're a person that likes to be extra cautious, you might consider draining the tank and letting it air out before you do this. But for our purpose, we are going to go ahead and remove the fuel sender. And for some reason, I came with a screwdriver. I was thinking I've always seen just regular slotted head, button head screws holding these on. Well, there's 5 Phillips screws holding this one on. So, not sure exactly what was original. I'd have to look in the parts book. But we just take what comes. I'd already tried taking the screw loose, or the nut loose on the terminal on the sending unit, and found out that it's Mother Nature has decided that it needs to stay in place since it was new. And you gotta love the wiring job that's on here, but somebody else who will remain nameless did that excellent wiring job. We're gonna take all these screws out. Alright, we've got our screws out. Now, sometimes we've had this fuel tank off previously, some time ago, and painted the outside, but before we did that, there was a lot of dirt and accumulation up here. You might even have to dig around to even find the sending unit. Lord knows how much of the wire coating might have been chewed off by mice in the last 50 years and whatnot. So definitely want to exercise caution. I did go ahead and disconnect the vent tube on our tractor just for the sake of it not being in the way. But you don't necessarily have to disconnect the vent tube. So we're going to go ahead and pull the sending unit out of the tank. Be careful not to lose the float if you can help it. So that's what the original looks like. And that might be why it would not have worked, since the float is rusted solid. For what that's worth. So, well, after, let's see, 1959, yeah, it's been in there some odd years. Since I really don't want to count, use all my fingers and toes to count. Now, some sort of an odd gasket in here. Now, the originals I've seen were cork. This looks like some sort of a gasket, homemade material of some sort. But anyway, remove the old gasket, and probably a good idea to perhaps use a vacuum in this case, and suck away all the dirt and dust. You don't want to get that down in your fuel. So the next step for us here is to install the new fuel sender. Well, thankfully Steiner has gotten the float set relatively identical to the original in terms of position. It's just a slightly shorter shaft, but the potentiometer's obviously of different make. So, that being said, note that the sending unit has 5 holes, and the gasket corresponds to 5 holes. However, they are not spaced equal distance from one another. So, to save us some time ahead of time, with a white paint pen, or a marker of your choice, I turned the gasket around until all the holes lined up, and then I marked it with a white paint pen to save a little time. Now, it's also important to note the orientation in your tank. On this particular tank, you clearly want the float to go straight back into the tank. So, that being said, we're going to go ahead and slip into our tank, and there we are. Now all we've got to do, because it's so easy, is line up our screws. We've got all the wires hooked up now. It's a moment of truth. But before we do that, we had the ground wire, power wire from the sending unit to the gauge, and then from the ground wire on the gauge on one of the terminals that you use to hold everything on, or on the gauge mounting, then we teed into that. with another ground wire, and we ran it to a bolt head in the casting somewhere, and you can choose whichever bolt you want to use, but you have to ground it to somewhere. And we did find ground is absolutely essential, because if you get to wiggling, this tank is not that well grounded, and the ground wire is necessary to make it all work right. So, drum roll please. Looks like we have a quarter tank, which is just right. 5 gallons on a 22-gallon tank, give or take, would be a quarter tank. So now we have a working fuel gauge, and I guess since we have a working gauge now, I can retire my good old faithful gauge that I used to check the fuel level. So that being said, we'll throw that out, and there you have it. So the important key parts is obviously take care in installing. Make sure you disconnect your battery when doing the whole process, since we're working with electricity and around a gas tank. And make sure that we have that ground wire hooked up. So that being said, now we know where our gasoline level is as an optional item from the original factory in Waterloo. And hopefully we don't look quite as foolish if we run out of gas on at plow day or something like that. And if we do, we can't blame it on the gauge. That would be operator error. So hope you had fun following along with Alex and I here on this John Deere 630 fuel gauge project. And best of luck on you and your project. So hopefully everything goes just as smooth, or maybe even easier. So take care, and until next time.